So now let's take a look at the compile service. The compile service is used heavily internally by Angular, and it is used whenever a page is loaded. Angular uses the compile service to look through the page for directives and process them. But you can also use the compile service yourself, and typically you'd do that inside a directive, but since we haven't shown you directives yet, we'll just quickly show you how you would use the compile service, and we'll do it inside a controller. So for this example, I've created a compile sample controller and this compile sample page. And you can just copy the cache sample HTML file and the cache sample controller to make these. That's what I did. Just make sure that you update the ng controller reference and the JavaScript reference to the controller. So we're going to use this HTML here. So we have this append here div that's just an empty div to start with. And then we have these two input boxes, one that's bound to name and one that's bound to markup. And then we have a button that when we click on it, it will call append div to element, passing in the markup. So let's go over to our controller now, and let's insert this method here. So this is that append to div element that's going to be called by that button on our page. And it takes in markup, and then you can see here that we're calling the compile service and we're passing in the markup that was passed into our method. And so we're compiling that markup and we're doing it within the context of the scope, which is what we're passing in. So you'll notice that the compile method actually returns a linking function. So it actually returns a function, and then that function is called and the scope is passed into that function. So we compile the markup in the context of the scope, and then that markup is appended to the append here div that we created. So angular.element that we're using here is similar to jQuery. So you can find elements on the page using similar selectors to what you would use in jQuery. And so we're just going to append the results of the compile to that element. So now if we go over and take a look at this page, it's currently blank. Let's refresh that. So there's our two input boxes that we created. So in here we'll just put somebody's name, John. And then the markup is going to be just an h3 element with a Angular binding to name. And remember, this text box, this first text box is bound to name, and so we're going to, that's what we're referencing here. Now this markup is what's going to be passed into the function on our controller that's going to call the compile service. So now if I click append, watch what happens. Look at that. We got our name written out in an H3 here. Of course, you probably also noticed that we got a console error. That's because what we're doing here is actually quite dangerous. Angular is trying to protect us from opening ourselves up to JavaScript injection attacks. Notice that if we do this again, I can just inject some script into the HTML and it will execute the script. So let's refresh this, do this again. Only this time let's add some JavaScript to it. Now notice that when I click the button, our JavaScript renders. That's really dangerous. So you really shouldn't do this. But this does demonstrate how the compile service works, and you might use the compile service in directives. But anytime you use the compile service to create an element and then try to render that on your page, you'll get this error, and you should avoid doing that. But just to continue this example, let's get rid of this script. And let's take a look at one more example. What if we were now to, instead of an H3, pass in the markup button? And it's a button now that has the text of name, and now we append that. Okay, so we're actually creating elements here, and we're using Angular to compile them, including, and that will compile even the Angular markup that's in there. So name is getting replaced with John. But notice that's not just getting replaced with a string. This is actually a binding. So I can type whatever I want in here, and that is now bound to those elements that we created. So going back to our code in our controller, the markup that we were typing into the text box gets passed in, and then it compiles it and then appends the compiled element to the append here method. So that's kind of the idea of the compile element, is it will take a bit of HTML and it will compile that and process any directives or bindings inside the HTML and create a function that then, when it is called and given a scope, will generate HTML.